Nihilism is not what most people think it is. It is not simply depression dressed in black clothing, nor is it the philosophy of giving up. When we trace nihilism through history, we are not following a single idea, but watching a philosophical earthquake whose aftershocks continue to reshape how we understand truth, morality, meaning, and existence itself. Nihilism has influenced political movements, driven artists to create revolutionary works, shaped how we understand science and religion, and even altered how we build our societies. The word nihilism comes from the Latin nihil, meaning nothing. But this nothing is not empty space. It is a nothing that eats away at certainty, that questions whether the things we hold most sacred, our values, our purposes, our truths, actually stand on any firm ground at all. And paradoxically, this confrontation with nothingness has been one of the most productive forces in human thought. This analysis will take you through nihilism's actual evolution, not the cartoon version. We will examine its roots in ancient skepticism, its explosive emergence in 19th century Europe, its fragmentation into multiple forms, and its continuing influence on how we live today. We will look at where nihilism succeeds in revealing uncomfortable truths, where it fails to provide workable alternatives, and why serious thinkers continue to wrestle with it despite its apparent bleakness. Part 1. The Seeds of Nothing, Ancient and Early Modern Roots. Nihilism did not spontaneously appear in the 19th century. Its roots stretch back thousands of years to the moment humans first questioned whether their inherited beliefs actually corresponded to reality. In ancient India, around the 6th century before the Common Era, a school of thought called Charvaka, or Lokayata, emerged that rejected all religious and metaphysical claims. These thinkers argued that only what we can perceive directly through our senses actually exists. There is no soul, no afterlife, no divine justice, just matter combining and separating. One of their surviving fragments states, "There is no heaven, no final liberation, nor any soul in another world." This was not pessimism, but a radical materialism that stripped away supernatural meaning and left only immediate physical existence. The Charvaka philosophers went further. They argued that the religious texts, the Vedas, were merely the clever inventions of priests who wanted to maintain their power and income. Sacrifice to the gods, they claimed, was just a way for priests to eat well at others' expense. This is crucial because it shows an early recognition that meaning systems, even sacred ones, might be human constructions serving human interests rather than eternal truths. Meanwhile, in ancient Greece, the Pyrrhonian skeptics developed a different approach to undermining certainty. Founded by Pyrrho of Elis around the 3rd century before the Common Era, this school argued that for every argument we can construct an equal and opposite argument. Therefore, we should suspend judgment about everything and achieve tranquility through not committing to any beliefs at all. This was not quite nihilism because it aimed at peace through non-commitment rather than confronting the absence of meaning, but it established a crucial precedent that our most confident claims might rest on nothing more solid than custom and rhetoric. The Greek skeptic Sextus Empiricus, writing in the 2nd century of the Common Era, catalogued dozens of arguments showing how human beliefs contradict each other across cultures and across time. What one society calls virtuous, another calls vice. What seems beautiful in one place appears ugly in another. If our moral and aesthetic judgments are this variable, he asked, what makes us think they reflect any objective truth at all? But these ancient challenges to meaning remained contained within specific philosophical schools. They did not explode into broader culture because the social structures around them, religious institutions, political hierarchies, traditional ways of life, remained largely intact and unchallenged. The real preparation for nihilism began in early modern Europe with the dismantling of intellectual certainty. When Nicholas Copernicus argued that Earth was not the centre of the universe, he did more than rearrange astronomy. He displaced humanity from its cosmic centrality. When Galileo Galilei pointed his telescope at the heavens and saw moons orbiting Jupiter, he demonstrated that direct observation could contradict inherited authority, even religious authority. Then came the philosophers, who turned this scientific skepticism inward toward human knowledge itself. René Descartes, in the 17th century, tried to find absolute certainty by doubting everything he could possibly doubt. He imagined an evil demon deceiving him about everything, making even mathematics and logic unreliable. Descartes thought he had found certainty in his famous "I think, therefore I am," but his method of radical doubt opened a door that later thinkers would push much wider. If we can doubt everything, what happens if we cannot find our way back to certainty? David Hume, writing in the 18th century, pushed this further. He argued that we cannot actually prove causation. When we see one billiard ball strike another and the second ball moves, we observe succession, one event following another, but not the necessary connection between them. We assume causation through habit, but we never actually perceive it. Similarly, Hume argued, we cannot rationally justify induction, the idea that the future will resemble the past. We believe the sun will rise tomorrow only because it always has, but this reasoning is circular. It assumes the very regularity it tries to prove. Hume's implications were devastating, though he himself remained cheerful. If we cannot prove causation or justify induction, then all scientific knowledge rests on habit and psychological tendency rather than rational foundation. We act as if the world is orderly and knowable, but we cannot prove it actually is. This left human knowledge floating without anchor. Most importantly for nihilism's evolution, Immanuel Kant in the late 18th century tried to rescue philosophy from Hume's skepticism, but ended up creating new problems. Kant argued that we can never know things as they are in themselves, only as they appear to us through the structures of human perception and understanding. Space, time and causation are not features of reality itself, but frameworks that human minds impose on experience. This meant that all human knowledge is fundamentally about our own mental structures, not about reality as it actually is. Think about what this means. Every scientific law, every moral principle, every truth claim exists within the prison of human cognition. We can never break through to see if our elaborate intellectual constructions correspond to anything real outside our own heads. Kant thought this still left room for morality and meaning, but later thinkers saw something more disturbing, that we are trapped inside our own perspectives, with no way to verify whether anything we believe about reality, meaning or value is actually true. By the early 19th century, European thought had systematically dismantled the old certainties. Religious authority had been challenged by science. Reason itself had been shown to rest on unprovable assumptions. Human knowledge had been revealed as potentially just elaborate human constructions with no guarantee of corresponding to reality. The stage was set for someone to look at this wreckage and draw the most radical conclusion, that nothing might actually be true, that all our values might be arbitrary, that existence itself might be fundamentally meaningless, that someone, or rather those someones, would emerge in the 19th century and give nihilism its modern form. Part 2. The Explosion, 19th Century Nihilism. The word nihilism first gained widespread currency in 19th century Russia, and it meant something very different from what we think of today. In the 1850s and 60s, young Russian intellectuals called themselves nihilists with pride. They were not wallowing in despair, but declaring war on traditional society. These Russian nihilists rejected all inherited authority, aristocratic privilege, religious dogma, romantic sentiment and conventional morality. They believed only in science, reason and material reality. Everything else was superstition that needed to be swept away. They cut their hair short, wore plain clothes, spoke bluntly, and refused to observe social niceties they considered hypocritical. Women in this movement were particularly radical, rejecting marriage conventions and demanding education and independence. Ivan Turgenev's novel Fathers and Sons, published in 1862, gave nihilism its most famous portrayal. The protagonist, Bazarov, is a medical student who believes only in what can be dissected and analyzed. When challenged about his rejection of art, tradition and principles, he declares, "A decent chemist is 20 times more useful than any poet." Bazarov denies everything that cannot be tested empirically, including love, though the novel shows him ultimately undone by emotions he claimed did not exist. But Russian nihilism was fundamentally optimistic. These nihilists believed that once you cleared away the rubble of tradition, you could rebuild society on rational, scientific foundations. They thought destruction was the first step toward construction. This was nihilism as method, not as end point. Burn down the old world to make room for something better. This optimistic nihilism had a darker twin that emerged in revolutionary politics. Some Russian radicals, influenced by nihilist ideas, concluded that if all moral values are groundless, then any action is justified if it serves the revolution. Sergei Nechayev, a revolutionary in the 1870s, wrote in his Catechism of a Revolutionary that the revolutionary has no personal interests, no affairs of his own, no feelings, no attachments, no property, not even a name. Everything, including murder, was permissible for the cause. This showed how nihilism could flip from liberation into a new form of tyranny. If nothing has intrinsic value, then nothing is forbidden. Meanwhile, in Germany, a more philosophically sophisticated form of nihilism was emerging. Max Stirner, writing in 1844, produced The Ego and Its Own, one of the most extreme individualist texts ever written. Stirner argued that all abstractions, God, state, society, humanity, morality, even truth itself, are spooks or phantoms that tyrannize individuals. These abstractions have no real existence. Only concrete individuals exist, and each individual should recognize that they are the center of their own universe. Stirner's nihilism was total. He rejected not just religious and political authority, but all general principles whatsoever. Even calling something true or good means submitting to an abstraction instead of following your own unique will. He wrote, "I am not nothing in the sense of emptiness, but I am the creative nothing, the nothing out of which I myself as creator create everything." This is crucial to understand. Stirner was not saying life is meaningless and therefore depressing. He was saying that all meaning systems are fictional, so stop pretending they are real, and instead consciously create your own purposes without guilt or self-deception. You owe nothing to God, country, humanity, or any other abstraction. You are free, completely and terrifyingly free, to do whatever you actually want. Stirner's ideas were too radical even for most radicals. Karl Marx attacked him viciously, understanding that Stirner's egoism undermined the very possibility of collective revolutionary action. If only individuals are real, and all general concepts are illusions, then there is no working class, no historical progress, no communist future, just individuals pursuing their own interests. Stirner had dissolved not just traditional morality, but any basis for social solidarity. What made 19th century nihilism explosive was not philosophical argument, but social collapse. Traditional European society was disintegrating under the pressures of industrialization, urbanization, and the decline of religious faith. Millions of people were uprooted from rural communities with their inherited ways of life and thrown into cities where the old certainties no longer functioned. The social soil that had nourished traditional meaning was eroding. Friedrich Nietzsche, watching this, understood that nihilism was not just a philosophy, but a historical event. It was not something a few intellectuals believed, but something that was happening to European civilization as a whole. And unlike the Russian nihilists who thought clearing away tradition would let reason flourish, Nietzsche saw that the rot went deeper. It was not just God who was dying, but the entire framework of meaning that had made life bearable. Part 3. Nietzsche's diagnosis, the death of God and its consequences. Friedrich Nietzsche did not invent nihilism, he diagnosed it. And his diagnosis remains the most penetrating analysis we have of what nihilism actually means for human existence. Nietzsche's famous declaration that God is dead is almost always misunderstood. He was not celebrating or even making a claim about God's existence. He was making a historical observation. European civilization had been built on Christian faith, and that faith was collapsing among educated people. The churches might still be standing, the rituals might continue, but genuine belief in Christian metaphysics and morality was evaporating. And Nietzsche asked, what happens next? In The Gay Science, published in 1882, Nietzsche tells the parable of the madman who runs into the marketplace shouting that he has killed God. The people in the marketplace, who do not believe in God anyway, laugh at him. But the madman understands something they do not. He asks, what did we do when we unchained this earth from its sun? Where is it moving to now? Where are we moving to? Away from all suns. Are we not continually falling? And backwards, sidewards, forwards, in all directions? Is there still an up and down? Are we not straying as though through an infinite nothing? This is the crucial point. God's death does not just mean we stop going to church. It means the entire structure of meaning, purpose and value that was built on that foundation collapses. If there is no God, then there is no cosmic purpose, no objective morality, no ultimate justice, no meaning inscribed into the fabric of reality itself. We are not moving toward anything or away from anything because there is nowhere to move toward. We are just happening, and then we stop happening. Nietzsche saw that most people had not grasped this yet. They had stopped believing in God but kept believing in Christian morality, in objective values like equality, compassion and justice. But Nietzsche argued these values made sense only within a Christian framework. Why should we value the weak and suffering if there is no God who commands it, and no afterlife where wrongs are righted? Why should we think all humans have equal worth if we are just sophisticated animals produced by blind evolution? This is what Nietzsche meant by nihilism, the realization that our highest values are devaluing themselves. We suddenly see that the things we thought were absolutely true and good are actually just human inventions with no foundation. And this realization, Nietzsche warned, would lead to 2 centuries of catastrophe as European civilization tried to cope with the collapse of its meaning structures. He was writing in the 1880s. The 20th century, with its world wars, totalitarian movements and mass murders, suggests he was not wrong. Nietzsche distinguished between passive and active nihilism. Passive nihilism is exhaustion. the sense that nothing matters, so why bother? This is the nihilism of decline, of people who have lost faith but found nothing to replace it and so drift into apathy, depression or addiction. They see through the old values but lack the strength to create new ones. Active nihilism is different. It is the deliberate destruction of old values to make room for something new. Nietzsche saw this as potentially healthy, a sign of strength rather than weakness. Active nihilists do not merely lament that God is dead. They take responsibility for the death and ask, "Now what shall we create?" But Nietzsche's most important contribution was recognizing that we cannot simply return to the old values once we have seen through them. You cannot unlearn what you have learned. Once you have understood that morality is a human construction, not a divine command or natural law, you cannot go back to naive belief. Any attempt to restore traditional values is either dishonest or superficial. So Nietzsche proposed that we must go through nihilism, not around it. We must fully experience the vertigo of a meaningless universe, must feel the collapse of all our certainties, and then from that abyss create new values. This is what he meant by the Übermensch, the overman or superhuman. Not a biological superman, but someone who creates their own values consciously, deliberately, without needing the crutch of divine authority or tradition or objective truth. Nietzsche's metaphor was the three metamorphoses of the spirit. First, the spirit is a camel, bearing the heavy burden of traditional values. Then it becomes a lion saying, "I will," instead of "thou shalt," destroying the old values. But the lion cannot create, only destroy. Finally, the spirit must become a child, capable of innocence and play, creating new values not from reaction, but from genuine affirmation of life. Here is where Nietzsche's analysis becomes both brilliant and problematic. He argued that life itself must become the standard of value. Whatever enhances life, whatever increases power, creativity and vitality is good. Whatever diminishes life is bad. But Nietzsche never clearly explained what he meant by life or power, and his followers have interpreted these concepts in wildly different ways, some seeing them as celebration of individual creativity, others as justification for domination and cruelty. Nietzsche also proposed the idea of eternal recurrence as a test. Imagine that your life will repeat eternally exactly as it is, with every joy and suffering recurring infinitely. Could you affirm this? Could you say yes to your life as it actually is, with all its pain and absurdity, without needing to justify it through reference to some higher purpose or future redemption? Nietzsche thought this was the ultimate test of whether you have overcome nihilism, whether you can embrace existence without needing it to mean anything beyond itself. But many readers have asked, does this actually overcome nihilism or just rebrand it? If life has no inherent meaning and we must create our own values from nothing, are we really finding meaning or just distracting ourselves from meaninglessness? Nietzsche's answer seems to be that this question itself still assumes there should be some inherent meaning, that it still wants cosmic reassurance. True amor fati, love of fate, means giving up the demand that existence justify itself and instead learning to dance in the void. What is clear is that Nietzsche saw nihilism not as a philosophical error to be refuted, but as a cultural illness to be endured and hopefully transformed. He thought European civilization had no choice but to pass through nihilism because the death of God was not reversible. The question was whether we would be destroyed by this passage or emerge stronger and more honest on the other side. The 20th century would test this question in ways Nietzsche could barely imagine. Part 4. The Varieties of Nihilism, Mapping the Terrain. Nihilism is not one thing but a family of related positions, each targeting a different aspect of human meaning. Understanding these varieties is essential because they have different implications and require different responses. Epistemological nihilism targets knowledge and truth. It claims that we cannot actually know anything, or at least cannot know that we know anything. This might sound like simple skepticism, but it goes further. Skepticism says we should withhold judgment because evidence is insufficient. Epistemological nihilism says there is no truth of the matter to know, or that the concept of truth itself is incoherent. Friedrich Nietzsche flirted with epistemological nihilism when he wrote, "There are no facts, only interpretations." If all our knowledge claims are just interpretations shaped by our perspectives, needs, and power relations, then truth becomes impossible. We can never step outside our own perspectives to see reality as it actually is. All we have are competing narratives, none more true than any other. Postmodern thinkers in the late 20th century pushed this further. They argued that truth claims are always embedded in power structures and serve political functions. What we call knowledge is actually just whatever story the powerful have successfully imposed. This has radical implications. If there is no objective truth, only power relations, then rational debate becomes pointless. All that matters is who has the power to make their interpretations stick. But epistemological nihilism faces a devastating problem. It refutes itself. If there is no truth, then the claim that there is no truth cannot be true either. If everything is interpretation, then so is the claim that everything is interpretation. You cannot coherently assert that truth does not exist because assertion itself presupposes truth. This does not mean epistemological nihilism is easily dismissed. It captures something real about how difficult truth is to establish, but it cannot be consistently maintained. Metaphysical nihilism targets existence itself. It claims that nothing actually exists, or that existence is not a real property, or that the question of why there is something rather than nothing has no answer and perhaps no meaning. This sounds absurd until you probe deeper. What does it mean for something to exist? You might say, I exist because I'm thinking right now. But what is this I that exists? When you look for it, you find only thoughts, sensations, memories, but no separate self that has them. The Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna, writing in the 2nd century, argued that all things lack inherent existence because everything depends on everything else. A table exists only in relation to its parts, its causes, the concept we apply to it. Nothing has existence in and of itself. Martin Heidegger, in the 20th century, argued that Western philosophy had forgotten the question of being. We talk about beings, things that exist, but we have lost the ability to think about being itself, the fact that anything exists at all. And this forgetting has led to a kind of metaphysical homelessness, where existence feels empty and arbitrary. Heidegger did not quite endorse metaphysical nihilism, but he diagnosed it as the condition of modern life, where beings have lost their being. Moral nihilism is perhaps the most disturbing variety. It claims that there are no objective moral truths, that nothing is actually right or wrong, good or evil. All moral claims are either expressions of emotion, assertions of power, or evolutionary accidents with no more reality than personal preferences. J. L. Mackie, a 20th century philosopher, argued for what he called the error theory of morality. He claimed that when we make moral judgments, we are trying to describe objective moral properties, but no such properties exist. So all moral judgments are false, though sometimes useful fictions. When you say torture is wrong, you think you are describing something real about torture, but you are actually just expressing your disapproval or invoking a social convention. The implication is chilling. If there is no objective morality, then the Nazi who thinks genocide is right and the humanitarian who thinks genocide is wrong are both equally correct or equally incorrect. Neither has truth on their side because there is no truth to have. They just have different feelings, different cultural programming, different power positions. Moral nihilists respond in different ways to this conclusion. Some, like the Marquis de Sade in the 18th century, embrace it as liberation. If nothing is actually wrong, then you are free to pursue pleasure without guilt. Others, like the contemporary philosopher Joel Marx after his conversion to moral nihilism, report feeling liberated from moral anger and judgment while still maintaining ethical behavior based on personal sentiment rather than obligation. Still others see moral nihilism as terrifying precisely because it seems to remove any principled basis for condemning atrocity. Existential nihilism is what most people think of when they hear the word nihilism. It is the claim that human life has no inherent meaning, purpose or value. We are not here for any reason. We are cosmic accidents in an indifferent universe. Our births are arbitrary, our deaths are final, and nothing we do ultimately matters. Albert Camus captured existential nihilism in his essay The Myth of Sisyphus. He compared human existence to the Greek myth of Sisyphus, condemned to roll a boulder up a hill for eternity, only to have it roll back down each time. Our lives are like this, repetitive, pointless and inescapable. We work, we eat, we sleep, we entertain ourselves, we age, we die, and then the next generation does the same thing. Nothing is accomplished, nothing is resolved. The boulder always rolls back down. The Russian writer Leo Tolstoy, in his spiritual crisis documented in A Confession, confronted existential nihilism directly. He had achieved everything, fame, wealth, family, artistic success, and found it all meaningless. He wrote, "My question, the question that brought me to the edge of suicide when I was 50 years old, was the simplest question lying in the soul of every person. Why should I live? Why should I wish for anything or do anything? Or to put it differently, is there any meaning in my life that will not be destroyed by the inevitable death awaiting me?" This is existential nihilism in its purest form, not the denial that we have purposes and projects, but the recognition that all our purposes seem trivial in the face of death and cosmic indifference. Finally, there is political nihilism, which denies that any political system, ideology or form of social organization is legitimate or justifiable. All political structures are just power dressed up as justice. Democracy is mob rule with better public relations. Human rights are convenient fictions that we take seriously until they become inconvenient. Revolution just replaces one set of oppressors with another. The 19th century Russian nihilists who turned to terrorism exemplified political nihilism. If all governments are illegitimate, then assassination and bombing are not murder, but acts of liberation. This reveals political nihilism's danger, without any political values worth preserving. Any act of destruction can be justified as clearing ground for something new, even when you have no clear idea what that something new will be. These varieties of nihilism often appear together but are logically independent. You could consistently believe that knowledge is impossible but that life has meaning. You could accept moral nihilism but reject existential nihilism. You could embrace existential nihilism but reject political nihilism. Understanding which form of nihilism someone holds is crucial for evaluating their position and its implications. What unites all these varieties is a common pattern. They take some domain where humans have sought certainty, truth, morality, meaning, legitimacy, and reveal that domain as groundless. We thought we were standing on bedrock and discover we are standing on nothing. The question then becomes, can we live without that ground, or must we either find new ground or pretend the old ground is still there? Part 5. Existentialist Confrontations, Wrestling with Meaninglessness. The existentialist movement of the 19th and 20th centuries represented philosophy's most sustained attempt to confront nihilism without either embracing it completely or retreating into comforting illusions. These thinkers accepted that existence has no inherent meaning, but insisted this recognition was the beginning of genuine philosophy, not its end. Søren Kierkegaard, writing in the 1840s, is sometimes called the first existentialist, though he would have rejected the label. Kierkegaard was a Christian, but his Christianity was born from despair, not comfort. He argued that rational philosophy cannot prove God's existence or life's meaning. All such proofs fail. We are left with a choice: either accept the absurdity of existence without God, or make a leap of faith that cannot be justified by reason. Kierkegaard's concept of despair is crucial. He argued in The Sickness Unto Death that humans exist in a constant state of potential despair because we are self-aware. We can reflect on ourselves, judge ourselves, imagine ourselves being different. This self-awareness means we can never simply be what we are the way an animal or a stone can. We are always at a distance from ourselves, always conscious that we could be otherwise. This gap between what we are and what we might be is the source of despair. But Kierkegaard saw 3 responses to this despair. First, you can try to lose yourself in immediate pleasure, distraction, and conformity, pretending you do not have this burden of self-awareness. Second, you can become obsessed with creating yourself through pure will, trying to be completely self-determining. Third, you can accept that you cannot ground yourself and instead ground yourself in relation to God through faith. Only the third option, Kierkegaard thought, escapes despair, but it requires giving up rational justification and embracing paradox. Whether Kierkegaard's leap of faith is a genuine response to nihilism or just a sophisticated evasion remains debated. Does faith overcome meaninglessness, or does it just replace one groundless position with another? Jean-Paul Sartre, writing a century later, rejected Kierkegaard's religious solution but intensified his analysis of human existence. Sartre's famous slogan, "Existence precedes essence," means that humans are not created with a predetermined nature or purpose. We simply find ourselves existing, thrown into the world, and then must decide what we will be. There is no human nature to discover, no God-given purpose to fulfill, no cosmic script to follow. We are condemned to be free, in Sartre's striking phrase. This freedom is not liberation, but burden. Because we have no fixed essence, we must constantly choose who we will be. And these choices cannot be justified by reference to anything outside themselves. When you make a moral decision, you cannot appeal to God's commands because God does not exist. You cannot appeal to human nature because there is no fixed human nature. You cannot appeal to consequences because you can never predict all consequences. You can only choose, and your choice defines you. Sartre called the refusal to accept this responsibility bad faith. Bad faith is pretending that you had no choice, that your actions were determined by your role, your emotions, your circumstances, or your nature. The waiter who loses himself completely in the role of waiter, mechanically performing his duties, is in bad faith. He's pretending to be a thing, a waiter object, rather than accepting that he is a free consciousness who is choosing to play this role. Similarly, someone who says, "I had no choice" about a moral action is in bad faith, because they are denying their freedom. But Sartre's position faces a devastating question. If there are no objective values to guide our choices, what makes one choice better than another? Sartre tried to argue that certain choices are authentic, while others are not, but his criteria for authenticity are unclear. And if all choices are equally groundless, why not choose to be cruel rather than kind, destructive rather than creative? Sartre never provided a satisfying answer to this, and his own political commitments — he supported communist causes despite their oppressive reality — suggest he struggled with the implications of his philosophy. Albert Camus, Sartre's contemporary and sometimes rival, approached nihilism from a different angle. Camus argued that the fundamental question of philosophy is suicide, whether life is worth living given its absurdity. By absurdity, Camus meant the confrontation between human need for meaning and the universe's silent indifference. We want reasons, purposes, and justice. The universe offers none. This mismatch, this divorce between what we demand and what we receive, is the absurd. Camus rejected suicide as a response to the absurd. Suicide would be escape, an admission of defeat. He also rejected what he called philosophical suicide, the leap into religious faith or abstract philosophy that pretends to resolve the absurd. Instead, Camus advocated revolt, not political revolution, but metaphysical revolt, a refusal to accept the absurd, but also a refusal to escape from it. In the myth of Sisyphus, Camus imagines Sisyphus happy. Why? Because Sisyphus has accepted his fate without illusion, but also without despair. He knows the boulder will roll down again, knows his labour is pointless, but he has made peace with this. The struggle itself, the effort to push the boulder, becomes sufficient. Camus writes, "The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy." This is compelling as poetry, but puzzling as philosophy. Why is pointless struggle enough to fill a heart? What makes meaningless action worth continuing? Camus seems to be asserting rather than arguing that we should embrace absurdity, and it is unclear what makes this assertion more than personal preference. Camus' novel The Stranger illustrates the absurd hero. The protagonist, Meursault, lives without conventional emotional responses or moral commitments. He does not cry at his mother's funeral. He shoots an Arab man almost accidentally and shows little remorse. He refuses to play the game of pretending his actions have deep meaning or moral significance. At his trial, society condemns him not just for murder, but for his failure to perform conventional emotions and embrace conventional meanings. Meursault represents radical honesty about the absurd, and society finds this honesty more threatening than crime itself. But here is the problem with Camus' position. If Meursault's indifference is authentic recognition of the absurd, why condemn the judges who sentence him? If nothing has intrinsic meaning, why is revolt against the absurd better than acceptance or escape? Why is Sisyphus happy rather than miserable? Or does the choice between happiness and misery itself become meaningless? Martin Heidegger approached similar territory, but from a different direction. Heidegger was not quite an existentialist and rejected that label, but his analysis of human existence, what he called Dasein, or being there, deeply influenced existentialism. Heidegger argued that humans are unique among beings because we care about our own existence. We do not just exist, we exist in relation to our existence, worrying about it, planning it, trying to understand it. This care is what makes us human, but it also creates a fundamental anxiety. We are always ahead of ourselves, projecting into future possibilities, aware that we are not yet what we will be. Most crucially, Heidegger argued that we flee from authentic existence into what he called the they. We adopt public opinions, conventional roles and average behaviours to avoid confronting our own mortality and freedom. We become what they say we should be. We do what one does. This is comfortable but inauthentic. Authentic existence requires confronting what Heidegger called being toward death. We must recognize that we will die, that death is not some distant event, but a constant possibility that shapes every moment. This recognition is anxiety-producing because it reveals the groundlessness of existence, but it also liberates us to take responsibility for our own lives rather than drifting along with the they. Heidegger's analysis is powerful but troubling. His concepts are notoriously obscure, and his political involvement with Nazism raises questions about whether his philosophy actually provides resources for ethical judgment. If authentic existence means owning your choices, does this apply equally to the Nazi and the resistance fighter? Heidegger never satisfactorily addressed this. What all the existentialists share is a refusal of two easy paths. They will not retreat into traditional religion or philosophy that pretends to provide objective meaning. But they also will not embrace nihilism completely and slide into despair or amorality. Instead, they try to find a way to live authentically, honestly and meaningfully precisely in the recognition that there is no inherent meaning. The question is whether they succeed. Do concepts like authenticity, revolt and being toward death actually overcome nihilism? Or do they just give us more sophisticated ways to cope with it? Are the existentialists offering genuine solutions or elaborate distractions from the recognition that existence might truly be pointless? This question has never been definitively answered. Part 6. 20th Century Developments, Fragmentation and Radicalization. The 20th century took nihilism in directions that would have shocked even Nietzsche. 2 world wars, totalitarian ideologies, genocide and the threat of nuclear annihilation made nihilism not just a philosophical position, but a lived reality for millions. The First World War shattered European confidence in progress, rationality and civilization. An entire generation of young men was destroyed in mechanized slaughter that made a mockery of traditional ideas about honor, sacrifice and meaning. Writers like Ernest Hemingway captured this in works like A Farewell to Arms, where the protagonist says abstract words such as glory, honor, courage or hallow were obscene beside the concrete names of villages, the numbers of roads, the names of rivers. The war revealed that grand narratives and noble language often just conceal pointless brutality. The Dada movement in art embraced nihilism explicitly. Disgusted by a civilization that could produce the trenches, artists like Tristan Tzara and Hugo Ball created deliberately meaningless art, random poems, absurd performances, anti-aesthetic provocations. The name Dada itself was supposedly chosen by randomly selecting a word from a dictionary. If civilization's highest achievements led to mass slaughter, maybe meaning itself needed to be destroyed. But Dada's nihilism was still hopeful in a perverse way. It destroyed old meanings to shock people into awareness, to create space for something new. By mid-century, that hope had largely evaporated. The rise of totalitarianism showed how nihilism could manifest politically. Both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, in different ways, represented the attempt to create meaning through pure will and power in a world where traditional meanings had collapsed. The Nazis rejected Enlightenment universalism and Christian morality as decadent fictions and tried to create a new value system based on race, will, and mythic destiny. The Soviets rejected traditional morality as bourgeois illusion and tried to build a new morality based on historical materialism and party discipline. Both systems, paradoxically, were responses to nihilism that themselves embodied nihilism. They recognized that traditional values had lost their authority, but responded by asserting that might makes right, that whoever has the power to impose their vision creates truth and morality. This is nihilism turned into state policy, the explicit recognition that there are no inherent constraints on power, that everything is permitted if you are strong enough to do it. Hannah Arendt's analysis of totalitarianism in the 1950s identified this nihilistic core. She argued that totalitarian movements attracted people who had lost all traditional ties, family, religion, community, and felt themselves superfluous in modern mass society. Totalitarianism offered a terrifying solution: make everything meaningful through total commitment to an ideology that explains everything and demands everything. The ideology itself did not have to be consistent or truthful. What mattered was total mobilization against a hostile world, creating meaning through struggle and elimination of enemies. After the Second World War, the Holocaust posed an even more profound challenge to meaning. How could one make sense of industrial genocide, of a highly educated nation methodically exterminating millions of people? Theodor Adorno famously asked whether it was possible to write poetry after Auschwitz. He meant that the traditional cultural forms, art, philosophy, religion, seemed obscene in the face of such horror. If civilization could produce the death camps, what was civilization worth? This led some thinkers to a darker nihilism. Not the heroic nihilism of destroying old values to create new ones, but a nihilism of exhaustion and defeat. Philosopher Emil Cioran, a Romanian who spent most of his life in France, wrote aphorisms of extreme pessimism. It is not worth the bother of killing yourself, since you always kill yourself too late. Only optimists commit suicide, the optimists who can no longer be optimists. Cioran's nihilism was not a call to action, but an expression of cosmic nausea, a sense that existence itself is a mistake. Meanwhile, postmodern philosophy was developing a more subtle and pervasive form of nihilism. Thinkers like Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault and Jean-François Lyotard did not usually identify as nihilists, but their work systematically undermined claims to truth, objectivity and stable meaning. Derrida's deconstruction showed how texts always contain internal contradictions and cannot establish stable meanings. Every attempt to ground meaning in something solid, presence, consciousness, nature, turns out to depend on what it claims to exclude. Meaning is always deferred, always dependent on other meanings in an endless chain with no foundation. This does not quite say meaning is impossible, but it suggests that all meaning is provisional, unstable, and undecidable. Foucault's genealogical method revealed how what we take as objective knowledge, psychiatry, medicine, criminology, sexuality, is actually shaped by power relations and historical contingencies. Truth is not discovered but produced through systems of power that determine what can be said and thought. This does not quite reduce truth to power, but it makes truth inseparable from power, which seems to amount to the same thing. Jean-François Lyotard defined postmodernism as incredulity toward meta-narratives. Meta-narratives are the grand stories civilizations tell to explain everything, progress through reason, salvation through faith, liberation through revolution. Lyotard argued that in the postmodern condition we can no longer believe these stories. They have been exposed as simplifications that serve particular interests. All we have left are local, provisional, competing narratives with no overarching truth to adjudicate between them. Critics accused postmodernism of being nihilism in academic disguise. If there is no truth, only power, then what is the point of scholarship or debate? If all perspectives are equally valid or invalid, then why should anyone care about evidence or argument? Postmodernists often responded that they were not denying truth, but only its metaphysical pretensions, that we can still make local pragmatic judgments without needing absolute foundations. But this response often seemed like having your cake and eating it too, claiming the radical insights of anti-foundationalism while avoiding its nihilistic implications. By the late 20th century, nihilism had become woven into popular culture in ways unimaginable a century earlier. Films like Fight Club portrayed characters deliberately destroying their comfortable lives because consumer capitalism had made existence feel meaningless. The protagonist says, "You are not your job, you're not how much money you have in the bank, you're not the car you drive, you're not the contents of your wallet." But having stripped away these false identities, the film offers only violence and destruction as alternatives, suggesting that nihilism has become an aesthetic, a pose, rather than a serious confrontation with meaninglessness. The punk movement in music embraced nihilism as rebellion against social conformity and middle-class values. The Sex Pistols' God Save the Queen declared, "There is no future in England's dreaming." But again, this was nihilism as style, as rejection of authority, not as sustained philosophical position. Once punk became commercialized, its nihilism became just another consumer choice. Philosopher Gianni Vattimo proposed weak thought as a postmodern response to nihilism. He argued that we should accept the weakening of strong metaphysical claims, but see this as liberation rather than loss. We no longer need absolute truth or universal morality. We can get by with provisional, flexible, interpretive approaches that avoid both dogmatism and despair. But critics asked whether weak thought was a genuine philosophical position or just intellectual resignation dressed up as wisdom. By the end of the 20th century, nihilism had become paradoxically both more prevalent and less shocking. Many people, especially in developed nations, live with assumptions that would have seemed nihilistic a century ago, that morality is relative, that meaning is self-created, that there is no cosmic purpose. But these assumptions often coexist with functional lives, careers, relationships, and projects. People have learned to live with what earlier generations would have considered unbearable meaninglessness. This raises a crucial question. Has humanity learned to overcome nihilism by accepting it and building meaning despite it? Or have we simply become numb to meaninglessness, distracting ourselves with consumerism, entertainment, and busyness while avoiding the depths of existential confrontation that earlier thinkers demanded? The 21st century has not yet answered this question. Part 7. Political, social and cultural manifestations, nihilism in practice. Nihilism is not just abstract philosophy, it has erupted into concrete historical movements and shaped how entire societies function. Understanding these manifestations shows both the seductive power of nihilistic thinking and its dangerous consequences. The Russian revolutionary movement of the late 19th century provides the clearest case of political nihilism in action. Figures like Sergei Nechayev took nihilistic premises that all traditional values are false, that nothing is inherently sacred, and weaponized them. Nechayev's Revolutionary Catechism is a chilling document. It declares that the revolutionary has severed every link with the social order and with the entire civilized world, with the laws, good manners, conventions, and morality of that world. Everything must be subordinated to a single purpose, destruction. What makes this nihilistic is not just the embrace of violence, but the explicit rejection of any moral constraints on that violence. Traditional revolutionaries believed they were fighting for justice, equality or freedom, values they thought were objectively good. Nietzsche dispensed with this. There is no justice, only power. There are no moral limits, only tactical calculations. If murdering innocent people advances the revolution, murder them. If betraying comrades serves the cause, betray them. Fyodor Dostoevsky captured this terrifyingly in Demons, also translated as The Possessed, where he portrayed a revolutionary cell that murders one of its own members to bind the group together through shared guilt. The character Shigalyov proposes a social system where 90% of humanity would be reduced to slavery, while 10% would have absolute freedom. When asked if this is just, Shigalyov responds that justice is irrelevant, only the system's stability matters. Dostoevsky saw that once you abandon moral absolutes, political thought becomes purely technical. How to gain and maintain power, with no constraints except effectiveness. The 20th century showed this pattern repeating at massive scale. Both fascism and Stalinism can be understood partly as political nihilism, the attempt to create meaning through power when traditional meanings have collapsed. The Nazi philosopher Alfred Rosenberg explicitly rejected Judeo-Christian morality as a slave morality that weakened the strong. Nazi ideology embraced a form of biological nihilism. Only racial survival matters. All other values are illusions. This justified any atrocity in service of racial purity and expansion. The Holocaust was not a betrayal of Nazi principles, but their logical conclusion: if only power and racial survival matter, then eliminating those deemed inferior or threatening is not merely permitted, but obligatory. Stalinism operated differently, but with similar nihilistic logic. Marxism-Leninism claimed to be scientific, to have discovered the laws of history. But in practice, this meant that whatever served the revolution was true, and whatever hindered it was false. Truth became whatever the party declared at any given moment. Yesterday's hero became today's enemy, and the historical record was rewritten accordingly. This is epistemological nihilism as state policy. Truth is whatever power says it is. The Soviet practice of forcing prisoners to confess to crimes they did not commit reveals this nihilism's depth. In Arthur Koestler's novel Darkness at Noon, based on the show trials, an old revolutionary confesses to treason he never committed because he has internalized the logic that individual truth is meaningless. Only the party's needs matter. This is what happens when nihilism about truth combines with absolute commitment to a cause. Reality itself becomes malleable. But political nihilism is not limited to totalitarian movements. Liberal democracies have their own forms of practical nihilism, though usually less violent. Consumer capitalism, some critics argue, embodies a kind of soft nihilism where all values are reduced to market preferences. Nothing is inherently better than anything else, only more or less popular, more or less profitable. Herbert Marcuse, writing in the 1960s, argued that advanced industrial society creates one-dimensional man, someone who has lost the ability to think critically or imagine alternatives. Everything is absorbed into the market. Art becomes entertainment. Rebellion becomes a style to be purchased. Even critique of the system gets commodified and sold back to consumers. This creates a comfortable nihilism where people pursue pleasures and distractions without believing in anything deeper, because the system has made deeper beliefs seem obsolete or naive. Guy Debord's Society of the Spectacle pushed this analysis further. He argued that in modern capitalism, life itself has become a spectacle, a representation separated from authentic experience. We do not live our lives, we consume images of life. We do not have relationships, we perform relationships for social media. We do not pursue meaning, We purchase lifestyle brands that simulate meaning. This is nihilism as alienation, where genuine experience and authentic meaning become impossible because everything is mediated through commodified representations. The contemporary culture wars in Western democracies reveal another form of practical nihilism. When all sides treat political disagreement purely as power struggle with no genuine truth claims at stake, we have entered nihilistic territory. If your opponents are not wrong but evil, if facts are dismissed as fake news when inconvenient, if winning by any means is the only goal, then politics has become nihilistic. There is no common reality to argue about, only competing wills to power. Social media has accelerated this trend. Platforms are designed to maximize engagement, which means amplifying emotional reactions and tribal identity rather than truth-seeking or nuanced understanding. In this environment, sincerity becomes performative, irony becomes the default mode, and the distinction between genuine belief and cynical posturing collapses. This creates what some call ironic nihilism, where people half believe everything and fully believe nothing, maintaining enough distance from any commitment to avoid vulnerability. The incel movement, involuntary celibates, provides a disturbing contemporary example of nihilism manifesting in subculture. Some members embrace what they call the black pill, a nihilistic worldview where biological determinism makes personal improvement pointless, where all social values are illusions masking evolutionary drives, and where violence becomes a rational response to meaningless existence. This is nihilism as resentment, the toxic combination of powerlessness and the conviction that nothing matters anyway. Environmental nihilism represents another contemporary manifestation. As climate change accelerates and political responses prove inadequate, some people adopt a burn-it-all-down mentality. If civilization is destroying the planet and cannot be reformed, why not embrace the destruction? Why make personal sacrifices for a future that will not arrive? Why care about sustainability when the system is already doomed? This nihilism is born from despair at collective failure, but it risks becoming self-fulfilling prophecy. The pharmaceutical response to existential suffering reveals another form of practical nihilism. Instead of addressing why life feels meaningless or examining social structures that create alienation, we increasingly treat existential problems as biochemical deficits requiring pharmaceutical correction. Suffering becomes a technical problem to be managed rather than a meaningful signal requiring interpretation. This medicalizes nihilism, pathologizing the sense that something is deeply wrong while avoiding asking what that something might be. Popular culture both reflects and reinforces practical nihilism. The Marvel Cinematic Universe's villain Thanos embodies a utilitarian nihilism. He will murder half of all life in the universe because he has calculated this serves the greater good. The film treats this as obviously wrong, but it is telling that the most compelling recent villains are often nihilists who have recognized that traditional morality is groundless and concluded that only power and will matter. Audiences are drawn to these characters precisely because they articulate something people half feel but fear to acknowledge. Video games often explore nihilistic themes more honestly than other media. Games like Spec Ops: The Line or The Last of Us force players to commit atrocities and then ask whether the mission or survival justifies the means. The player's agency, their power to choose actions, becomes implicated in the nihilistic logic that nothing is sacred if survival or victory requires its sacrifice. These games make nihilism experiential rather than abstract. The YOLO culture, you only live once, exemplifies a hedonistic response to practical nihilism. If life has no inherent meaning and death is final, then maximize pleasure, minimize pain, and do not worry about consequences beyond immediate experience. This sounds like ancient Epicureanism, but it usually lacks Epicurean moderation and wisdom. Instead, it often manifests as impulsive consumption, risk-taking for social media content, and perpetual distraction from deeper questions. Workplace culture in late capitalism reveals another dimension. Many people spend the majority of their waking lives in jobs they find meaningless, producing things or services they do not value, for purposes they do not understand or support. Anthropologist David Graeber's concept of bullshit jobs captures this. Entire industries of people performing tasks that they themselves believe contribute nothing meaningful to the world. This creates what we might call occupational nihilism, the daily performance of meaningless activity for economic survival. The wellness industry can be seen as commercialized response to practical nihilism. Yoga classes, meditation apps, self-help books, and life coaches promise to restore meaning and purpose. But often these function as palliatives that help people cope with meaninglessness rather than addressing its causes. They privatize and commodify the search for meaning, suggesting that fulfillment can be purchased rather than created through genuine community, purpose, or confrontation with existence. Contemporary art continues to explore nihilistic themes. Artists like Damien Hirst, whose works include animals preserved in formaldehyde and medicine cabinets filled with pills, confront viewers with death, commodification, and the reduction of meaning to shock value. But critics ask whether such art genuinely grapples with nihilism or merely exploits it for market success. When nihilistic art sells for millions of dollars to wealthy collectors, has it become just another commodity, another form of the nihilism it supposedly critiques? Music provides perhaps the most direct expression of practical nihilism. Beyond punk's early nihilism, genres like black metal explicitly embrace nihilistic themes, cosmic indifference, the meaninglessness of existence, and sometimes the beauty of destruction. Bands like Dark Throne or Mayhem create music that sonically embodies meaninglessness, chaotic, dissonant, often deliberately unpleasant. For fans, this music provides catharsis, a way to confront and express feelings that polite society demands be suppressed. What all these manifestations share is that nihilism has moved from philosophical abstraction to lived reality. It is not just that some people believe nothing matters, but that social, economic and cultural structures often operate as if nothing matters beyond power, profit and survival. We have built systems that are functionally nihilistic, even when most people in them do not consciously identify as nihilists. This makes nihilism harder to confront because it is not just in our heads, but embedded in our institutions and practices. Part 8. Critiques and where nihilism fails, the limits of nothingness. Nihilism has always attracted fierce criticism, not just from traditionalists defending old values, but from philosophers who accept many of nihilism's insights yet argue it is ultimately incoherent, self-refuting, or practically unlivable. These critiques reveal where nihilism succeeds as diagnosis but fails as solution. The most fundamental critique is that nihilism is self-refuting. If you claim that nothing is true, then that claim itself cannot be true. If you assert that all values are groundless, you are implicitly valuing truth, honesty, or rational argument by bothering to make the assertion. The very act of arguing for nihilism presupposes non-nihilistic commitments like the importance of rational persuasion, intellectual honesty, and the value of understanding. Philosopher Hilary Putnam made this argument forcefully against epistemological nihilism. He pointed out that relativists about truth still argue for their relativism, still marshal evidence, still correct misunderstandings. This shows they implicitly believe in truth, rational norms, and better and worse arguments, even while explicitly denying these things exist. Putnam called this mental cramps, tying yourself into conceptual knots that your own practice contradicts. The moral nihilist faces a similar problem. If you argue that morality is an illusion, you are implicitly appealing to intellectual honesty as a value. If you criticize people for being hypocritical or inconsistent, you are relying on logical norms that you must value. Even arguing that people should accept nihilism requires valuing truth and rationality over delusion and error. So moral nihilism, when argued for rather than simply lived, undermines itself. But nihilists might respond that this objection misses the point. Maybe nihilism is not a philosophical position to be argued, but a recognition to be faced. Maybe the self-refutation shows only that rational argument itself rests on groundless assumptions. Still, even this response requires making distinctions between better and worse ways of recognizing things, which smuggles values back in. A second major critique focuses on whether nihilism is actually livable. Can human beings genuinely exist without believing anything matters, without valuing anything, without having purposes? Even the most convinced nihilist continues to eat when hungry, avoid pain, pursue some pleasures over others. These choices reveal implicit values, implicit beliefs that some states of affairs are preferable to others. Philosopher Christine Kierkegaard argues that the structure of human consciousness makes nihilism impossible to consistently maintain. We face situations requiring choice, and choice is only intelligible if some options seem better than others. Even choosing randomly or choosing not to choose is itself a choice that implicitly values something, perhaps freedom from responsibility or aesthetic preference for randomness. So, genuine nihilism would require paralysis, and the fact that nihilists act at all shows they do not genuinely believe nothing matters. The existentialists confronted this problem directly. Sartre admitted that even in recognizing that existence has no inherent meaning, we cannot help but create meanings through our choices and commitments. Camus acknowledged that we must revolt against absurdity rather than surrender to it, which implies that revolt is somehow better than surrender. But their attempts to overcome nihilism while accepting its insights remain controversial, with critics arguing they smuggle in values they cannot justify. A third critique addresses nihilism's emotional and psychological costs. Even if nihilism is intellectually defensible, is it compatible with human flourishing? Research in psychology suggests that people need meaning, purpose and values to maintain mental health. Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist who survived Nazi concentration camps, argued in Man's Search for Meaning that the prisoners most likely to survive were those who maintained some sense of purpose, even arbitrary purpose like wanting to complete an unfinished book. Those who concluded that nothing mattered often lost the will to live. Frankl founded logotherapy on the premise that the will to meaning is fundamental to human nature. We can endure almost any suffering if we believe it means something, but even comfort becomes unbearable if we believe it means nothing. If Frankl is right, nihilism is not just intellectually wrong, but psychologically destructive, incompatible with human well-being. Of course, nihilists might respond that this shows only that we need comforting illusions, not that those illusions are true. A fourth critique focuses on nihilism's practical consequences. If we collectively embraced nihilism, would society be possible? Would cooperation, law, ethics, or any form of ordered life survive if everyone genuinely believed nothing matters? Political philosopher Michael Oakeshott argued that even the most minimal social cooperation requires shared conventions, practices, and implicit values. Language itself depends on shared norms about meaning. Promising, contracting, and basic trust require that people treat certain things as mattering, as creating obligations. A society of genuine nihilists would collapse because no one would have reason to keep promises, tell the truth, or respect others' rights when doing so conflicted with immediate self-interest. Nihilists might respond that this just shows society is built on useful fictions, but that these fictions work only so long as people believe them. Once we see through the fictions to the nihilistic truth, we cannot go back to naive belief, and society must either evolve new bases for cooperation or accept decline. A fifth critique, developed by philosopher Charles Taylor, argues that nihilism misunderstands the nature of values and meanings. Taylor argues that some things, human dignity, beauty, love, are experienced as mattering not because we choose to value them, but because they impose themselves on us as valuable. When you witness an act of extraordinary courage or compassion, you do not feel like you are projecting value onto a neutral event, but recognizing value that is really there. Taylor calls this strong evaluation, and he argues that nihilism cannot account for this phenomenological fact about how we actually experience values. Of course, nihilists can respond that the experience of objective value is just an illusion produced by evolution or culture. But Taylor points out that this explanation treats our most profound experiences as errors, which seems to privilege a suspicious, reductive interpretation over our direct experience. Why should we trust the abstract theory over the lived experience, especially when the theory undermines the very capacities, reason, honesty, rigour that we need to formulate and evaluate theories? Alasdair MacIntyre offers a historical critique of nihilism. He argues in After Virtue that moral nihilism arose from the failure of the Enlightenment project to justify morality through reason alone. When philosophers tried to ground ethics in pure rationality, detached from tradition, community and practice, they inevitably failed because morality cannot be justified abstractly. But this failure does not prove that morality is groundless, only that the Enlightenment approach was misguided. MacIntyre suggests returning to virtue ethics rooted in practices, traditions and communities, rather than accepting nihilism as the only alternative to failed Enlightenment foundationalism. Religious thinkers offer another line of critique. From a theistic perspective, nihilism is not just intellectually wrong, but spiritually catastrophic. Theologian Henri de Lubac argued that atheism inevitably leads to nihilism because once you remove God, you remove the ground of both being and value. And nihilism, he claimed, ultimately leads to dehumanization because if humans are not created in God's image, if we have no transcendent significance, then there is no principled reason to treat human life as sacred. The 20th century's atrocities, he suggested, were the predictable outcome of this loss of transcendent grounding. But this critique assumes what nihilists deny, that values need transcendent grounding. Many secular philosophers argue that we can ground ethics in human nature, reason or social contract without needing God. Whether they succeed remains debated. Some critics argue that nihilism, at least in its popular forms, is too comfortable, too bourgeois. Philosopher Slavoj Žižek suggests that contemporary cynicism, where people say they believe in nothing but continue living conventional lives, is not genuine nihilism, but its opposite. True nihilism would be unbearable, would tear apart your ability to function. The fact that people can cheerfully declare that nothing matters while continuing to work, consume and pursue status shows they do not genuinely believe their nihilistic claims. They perform nihilism as a pose while remaining invested in the very structures they claim to see through. There is also the pragmatist critique, developed by thinkers like William James and Richard Rorty. Pragmatists argue that the debate over whether values are objective or nihilism is true misses the point. What matters is not whether our beliefs correspond to some metaphysical reality, but whether they work, whether they help us solve problems, create meaningful lives, and build better societies. From this perspective, nihilism is false, not because it fails to correspond to reality, but because it does not work, it does not help us live well. But nihilists can respond that this just proves we need comforting illusions, not that the illusions are anything more than that. Perhaps the deepest critique comes from phenomenology's observation that nihilism treats meaning as something we project onto a meaningless world rather than recognizing that we are always already in a meaningful world. Martin Heidegger argued that the very question, why is there something rather than nothing, presupposes we stand outside of being, looking at it from nowhere. But we do not stand outside. We are always already thrown into a world that matters to us, that shows up as meaningful. Nihilism arises only when we abstract from this concrete involvement and treat the world as a meaningless object to be observed. So nihilism, from this perspective, is not seeing through illusions to reality, but losing touch with reality through excessive abstraction. Finally, there is the existential critique that nihilism, even if theoretically correct, demands a response rather than acceptance. Even if existence has no inherent meaning, we must create meaning because that is what human consciousness does. Albert Camus' Revolt and Jean-Paul Sartre's Authenticity are attempts to acknowledge nihilism while refusing to be paralyzed by it. The critique here is not that nihilism is false, but that it is incomplete. It is diagnosis without treatment, question without answer, problem without solution. What all these critiques share is recognition that nihilism, whatever its insights, is not the end of philosophy, but rather a crisis that demands further thinking. Nihilism is excellent at destroying false certainties, exposing hidden assumptions, and making us confront uncomfortable questions. But it provides no resources for reconstruction, for answering what now. And that limitation may be where nihilism ultimately fails, not because it is wrong about what it denies, but because denial alone is not enough to live by. Part 9. Contemporary scholarly debates where nihilism stands now. Contemporary philosophy has not abandoned nihilism, but rather fragmented into different camps, with competing interpretations of what nihilism means and whether it can be overcome. These debates reveal that nihilism remains a living philosophical problem, not a historical curiosity. One major debate concerns whether moral realism, the view that objective moral facts exist, can be defended against nihilistic challenges. Moral realists like Russ Schaefer Landau and David Enoch argue that moral truths are like mathematical truths, objective but not physical, discoverable through rational reflection rather than empirical observation. They claim that the fact that something is wrong, like torturing children for fun, is as objective as the fact that 2 + 2 = 4. Both are truths about abstract domains that do not depend on anyone's beliefs or preferences. But critics, including moral nihilists and constructivists, argue that the analogy fails. Sharon Street, for example, argues that Darwinian evolution shaped our moral intuitions to promote survival and reproduction, not to track objective moral truths. The fact that we find certain things morally repugnant may be just an evolutionary adaptation, like fear of snakes, rather than perception of objective moral reality. If our moral judgments would be roughly the same whether or not objective moral truths existed, how can we claim to be tracking such truths? This debate connects to the broader epistemological question of whether evolutionary debunking arguments undermine all our beliefs. If evolution shaped our cognitive capacities for survival rather than truth, why should we trust any of our beliefs, including our scientific and logical beliefs? Philosopher Alvin Plantinga argues that evolutionary naturalism, the view that our minds are products of blind evolution, is self-defeating because it undermines confidence in our reasoning abilities. But others respond that this proves too much. It would make all knowledge impossible, which is absurd. Another major debate concerns meta-ethical constructivism, the view developed by Christine Kierkegaard and others that moral truths are constructed through rational procedures rather than discovered or invented arbitrarily. Kierkegaard argues that certain moral principles are constitutive of rational agency. You cannot consistently act without implicitly committing to them. For example, if you act for reasons, you implicitly commit to the principle that reasons matter, which extends to respecting others as agents who also act for reasons. This does not give morality the kind of objective foundation moral realists want, but it claims to avoid nihilism by grounding morality in the structure of agency itself. Critics question whether Kierkegaard's argument actually works. Does rational agency really commit us to moral principles, or does it just commit us to instrumental rationality, being effective at achieving whatever goals we happen to have? Can you derive an ought from the structure of agency alone, or does this smuggle in substantive moral premises? The debate over relativism continues to divide philosophers. Cultural relativists argue that moral truths are relative to cultures, so what is morally required in one society may be morally forbidden in another. This seems to avoid nihilism because it admits that moral truths exist, just relativized to cultural contexts. But critics argue this collapses into nihilism because it means there are no transcultural standards by which to judge practices like slavery, genocide, or oppression. If morality is whatever a culture says it is, then Nazi Germany's morality was just as valid within its context as any other. Some philosophers, like Gilbert Harman, defend moral relativism by arguing that morality is fundamentally about social coordination rather than objective truth. Moral judgments are correct relative to the agreements and practices of a community, not relative to any independent moral reality. But this still faces the problem of explaining why we should care about morality at all if it is just conventional. The rise of experimental philosophy has brought empirical data into debates about nihilism. Researchers study what ordinary people actually believe about morality, meaning, and values. Some findings suggest that most people are natural moral realists. They intuitively think morality is objective, even if they cannot defend this philosophically. Other findings suggest that people's moral judgments are heavily influenced by emotions, framing effects, and cultural contingencies, which seems to support nihilistic views that morality is subjective or illusory. But Joshua Knobe and others argue that we should be careful about inferring philosophical conclusions from empirical data. The fact that people's moral judgments are influenced by emotions does not prove those judgments are subjective. Perhaps emotions are ways of perceiving moral reality. And the fact that people believe morality is objective does not prove it is, though it might suggest that moral realism is psychologically natural for humans. Another active debate concerns whether science undermines meaning and value. Physicalist philosophers like Alex Rosenberg argue that if physics is complete, if everything can be explained by particles interacting according to laws, then there is no room for meaning, purpose, or value in the fundamental structure of reality. These are at best useful fictions that our brains generate, but that do not correspond to anything real. This is scientific nihilism, the view that science reveals the universe to be meaningless, but others argue this is a category mistake. Thomas Nagel, for example, argues that trying to understand everything from the perspective of physics leaves out crucial aspects of reality, particularly consciousness, intentionality, and value. The fact that physics does not describe these things does not prove they are unreal, only that physics is not the complete story. Nagel suggests we need to expand our conception of nature to include mind and value as fundamental features, not reducible to physics. The hard problem of consciousness, articulated by David Chalmers, connects to this debate. If we cannot explain subjective experience in purely physical terms, if there is an irreducible what it is like to be conscious, then perhaps physicalism is false. And if physicalism is false, maybe there is room for meaning and value in the universe after all. But critics argue that even if consciousness is not reducible to physics, this does not show that values are objective or that life has inherent meaning. Some contemporary thinkers embrace what might be called optimistic nihilism or constructive nihilism. They accept that existence has no inherent meaning, but argue this is liberating rather than depressing. If nothing matters objectively, then you are free to create your own meaning without guilt or constraint. YouTubers like Kierkegaard have popularized this view, presenting nihilism as an opportunity for radical freedom and creativity. But critics question whether this is genuine nihilism or just rebranding positive thinking. If you can create your own meaning, in what sense was meaning absent in the first place? And what makes one created meaning better than another if there are no objective standards? Optimistic nihilism may be emotionally appealing, but it is unclear whether it is philosophically coherent. The effective altruism movement represents an interesting attempt to ground ethics without metaphysical foundations. Effective altruists argue that we should maximize well-being, understood in hedonic or preference satisfaction terms, because suffering is bad, regardless of whether there are objective moral truths. The wrongness of suffering is supposed to be self-evident from the experience of suffering itself. This sidesteps meta-ethical debates by focusing on practical ethical questions. How can we reduce the most suffering with our limited resources? But critics question whether effective altruism can avoid meta-ethical questions. Why should we maximize well-being rather than pursuing our own self-interest or aesthetic values? Effective altruists sometimes appeal to impartiality or consistency, but these themselves require justification. Without some account of why reducing suffering matters, effective altruism seems to rest on an unargued assumption that might itself be questioned from a nihilistic perspective. The debate over whether nihilism is necessarily pessimistic continues. Pessimists like Eugene Thacker argue that confronting the universe's indifference to human existence should produce horror and despair. His In the Dust of This Planet explores cosmic horror and the recognition that the world is fundamentally alien to human concerns. But others argue that nihilism can coexist with happiness, aesthetic appreciation, and social engagement, even if these lack ultimate justification. Some scholars examine historical nihilism to understand its social and cultural causes. Why does nihilism arise at certain historical moments and in certain places? Michael Gillespie's Nihilism Before Nietzsche traces nihilism's roots to medieval nominalism and the collapse of medieval synthesis. He argues that modernity was born from a kind of conceptual nihilism, the denial that universals are real, that gradually metastasized into moral and existential nihilism. Others, like Karen Carr, examine nihilism's relationship to capitalism and modernity. She argues that market society, where everything has a price but nothing has inherent value, naturally produces nihilistic consciousness. When traditional communities, religions and ways of life are destroyed by industrialization and commodification, people lose access to inherited sources of meaning and face existential void. There is also ongoing debate about whether postmodernism is a form of nihilism or a response to it. Critics like Stephen Hicks argue that postmodernism's rejection of objective truth and embrace of perspectivalism is nihilism dressed in academic jargon. Defenders argue that postmodernism is not nihilistic but rather seeks to expose false universalism and open space for marginalized voices and suppressed possibilities. The debate often turns on whether pluralism about truth is the same as nihilism about truth, a question without consensus answer. Some contemporary philosophers explore whether artificial intelligence and transhumanism pose new nihilistic challenges. If we can modify human nature through technology, if we might create artificial minds or upload consciousness, what happens to meaning and value? Does the malleability of human nature and the possibility of radical enhancement undermine traditional humanist values? Or does it offer new possibilities for overcoming biological limitations and creating meaning through conscious design? Nick Bostrom's work on existential risk connects to nihilism by asking whether humanity's potential extinction would matter. If humans go extinct, does the universe care? Obviously not. But should we care? Most people's intuition is yes, but justifying this without appeal to objective value proves difficult. Is preventing human extinction valuable only because we humans value it, making it a kind of circular self-justification? What these debates show is that nihilism remains philosophically unsettled. It is neither definitively refuted nor fully embraced, but continues to challenge philosophy to provide better accounts of truth, value, and meaning. Each generation must confront nihilism anew, and contemporary philosophy has not achieved consensus about whether nihilism is ultimately correct or how to overcome it if it is not. Part 10. Living with and Beyond Nihilism. Conclusion. We arrive at the end of this analysis facing the question that everyone who seriously engages with nihilism must answer for themselves. So what now? If nihilism is correct and existence has no inherent meaning, what do we do? If nihilism is wrong, why is it wrong, and what alternative can withstand its corrosive doubts? What should be clear by now is that nihilism is not simple or monolithic. It is a family of positions, each targeting different aspects of meaning and requiring different responses. Epistemological nihilism, moral nihilism, existential nihilism and political nihilism can be accepted or rejected independently. You might coherently believe that moral truths are objective while accepting that life has no cosmic purpose. Or you might believe that truth is objective while thinking morality is constructed. The combinations are numerous. This means that responding to nihilism requires diagnostic precision. Which form of nihilism are we confronting, and what exactly is its claim? Too often, discussions of nihilism conflate different questions and end up talking past each other. The strongest forms of nihilism, epistemological and moral, face the self-refutation problem we examined. They cannot be consistently argued for because argument presupposes norms, truth, logic, honesty that the nihilist must deny or at least cannot ground. This does not mean nihilism is false, but it suggests that complete nihilism is unlivable and perhaps unthinkable. Even nihilists implicitly commit to some values and truths when they think, speak and act, but weaker forms of nihilism remain more defensible. The claim that existence has no inherent purpose, that we are cosmic accidents in an indifferent universe, seems difficult to refute. The universe does not appear designed for human flourishing. The laws of physics do not encode moral principles. From the universe's perspective, if it even makes sense to speak of such a perspective, nothing matters. This is not something we can argue away through philosophical cleverness, so we face a choice about how to respond to this recognition. One option is Nietzsche's path: accept the death of God and inherited meaning, then create new values through conscious artistic self-fashioning. The problem is that created values seem arbitrary compared to discovered values. If I create my values, why should I care about them tomorrow? Why should anyone else care about them? And what prevents created values from becoming mere rationalization for whatever I happen to want? Another option is the existentialist path: acknowledge meaninglessness, but commit to creating meaning through choices and projects despite their ultimate groundlessness. This is Camus' revolt and Sartre's authenticity. The advantage is honesty. No illusions about cosmic purpose or objective morality, just human beings taking responsibility for their choices. The disadvantage is that it is unclear why this revolt is better than surrender, or whether authenticity without truth becomes just sophisticated self-deception. A third option is constructivism, the view that values and meanings are not discovered or invented, but constructed through rational procedures or social practices. Kierkegaard's grounding of morality and agency, Rawls's theory of justice as fair agreement, Habermas's discourse ethics, all attempt this. The advantage is avoiding both objectivism's implausible metaphysics and nihilism's corrosive doubts. The disadvantage is that constructed values seem vulnerable to the question, why should I participate in the construction? What if I reject your rational procedures or social contracts? A fourth option is pragmatism, giving up on metaphysical questions about whether values are objective and instead focusing on what works, what helps us solve problems and live well. William James's pragmatism and Richard Rorty's neo-pragmatism take this approach. The advantage is shifting from theoretical puzzles to practical concerns. The disadvantage is that it seems to evade rather than answer nihilism's challenge, and what works requires knowing what we are trying to achieve, which reintroduces questions about value. A fifth option is returning to religious faith, accepting that reason alone cannot ground meaning, but revelation, grace or mystical experience can. Kierkegaard's leap of faith, Dostoevsky's Christianity, contemporary theology all represent this path. The advantage is that traditional religions have centuries of accumulated wisdom about meaning, purpose, and how to live. The disadvantage is that once you have seen through religious claims to their cultural and psychological origins, once you have felt the full force of nihilistic doubt, faith often feels like intellectual dishonesty or wishful thinking. A sixth option, less commonly acknowledged, is simply living with the tension. Perhaps we cannot overcome nihilism theoretically, but can learn to function despite it. Most people do this anyway, holding loosely to meanings they half believe, pursuing goals they know are ultimately arbitrary, finding pleasure and connection without metaphysical justification. This is not philosophically satisfying, but philosophy may not be able to satisfy us on these deepest questions. What history suggests is that nihilism in its purest form is rare because it is unlivable. Even Nietzsche, who diagnosed nihilism so brilliantly, spent his life creating meaning through writing, thinking, and self-transformation. Even Camus, who embraced absurdity, valued truth, solidarity, and resistance to oppression. Even postmodern skeptics about truth care about exposing power relations and defending marginalized groups. The actions reveal commitments that the explicit philosophy denies. This might mean that nihilism is more useful as critical tool than positive philosophy. It excels at destroying false certainties, exposing arbitrary conventions, and forcing us to confront uncomfortable questions. But it cannot, by itself, provide a way to live. We need nihilism's honesty about the absence of cosmic reassurance combined with something else, commitment, care, creativity, community, that gives us reason to continue despite this absence. The 21st century faces distinctive nihilistic challenges. Climate change confronts us with the possibility that humanity's entire project might be self-terminating, which raises questions about whether anything we do matters if we are heading toward collapse. Artificial intelligence might eventually surpass human intelligence, making humans obsolete and raising questions about whether human meaning has any cosmic significance. The surveillance and manipulation inherent in digital capitalism create environments where authenticity becomes nearly impossible, where even our innermost thoughts might be shaped by algorithms optimizing for engagement rather than truth or well-being. These challenges require more than individual responses to nihilism. They demand collective action, social transformation, and institutions that can sustain meaning despite nihilistic conditions. But building such institutions requires believing that building them matters, which returns us to the problem nihilism poses. Perhaps the most honest thing to say is this: nihilism is correct that the universe has no inherent purpose or value. Nothing matters from the perspective of eternity, if such a perspective exists. We are temporary arrangements of matter that will eventually dissolve back into the cosmic void. From this cosmic vantage point, nothing we do makes any difference. But we do not live from the cosmic vantage point. We live from the human vantage point, embedded in time, relationships, and projects. From this perspective, things do matter because we make them matter. My love for particular people is not invalidated by the fact that love has no cosmic significance. Art is not rendered meaningless by the fact that the universe does not care about beauty. Justice is not less important because the laws of physics do not enforce it. The question is whether this human perspective has any validity or whether it is just comforting illusion that we should grow beyond. There is no proving that it has validity in any absolute sense. But we might turn the question around. Why should the cosmic perspective, if there is such a thing, be considered more real or true than the human perspective? Both are perspectives. The cosmic view is not a view from nowhere, but a view from the imagined standpoint of the universe as a whole, which may itself be a human construction. What if neither perspective is privileged? What if reality contains both the cosmic indifference that nihilism sees and the human meanings that nihilism dismisses? Not as competing claims about what really exists, but as different aspects of a reality too complex to be captured by either alone. This does not solve nihilism in the sense of refuting it. It suggests instead that nihilism captures one truth about existence, our cosmic insignificance, but not the only truth. There's also the truth of our immediate experience, where things do matter, where suffering is really bad and joy is really good, where beauty moves us and injustice enrages us. These experiential truths are not less real because they lack cosmic backing. In the end, we might see nihilism not as a problem to be solved, but as a permanent feature of honest thinking. The temptation to find absolute foundations, cosmic reassurance, objective grounding for our values will always collide with the recognition that no such foundations exist or can be proven to exist. This tension is not a bug, but a feature of human existence as self-aware beings who can question everything, including the questioning itself. Living well may require holding this tension rather than resolving it. Embracing the insights of nihilism, its honesty about cosmic indifference and the absence of inherent meaning, while also embracing the human need to create, care, connect, and commit. This is not having your cake and eating it too, but recognizing that existence contains contradictions that cannot be thought away. The evolution of nihilism from ancient skepticism through Nietzsche's diagnosis to contemporary debates shows philosophy struggling with perhaps its deepest question. Can we ground meaning and value, or must we learn to live without ground? The answer remains unsettled, and perhaps must remain unsettled, because the question touches the limits of what human thought can accomplish. What we can say with confidence is that nihilism, for all its bleakness, has been productive. It has forced philosophy to be more honest, to abandon comforting illusions, to examine its assumptions rigorously. It has inspired art, literature and cultural movements that confront existence with unprecedented seriousness. It has liberated many people from oppressive dogmas and freed them to create their own meanings. But nihilism alone is not enough. We also need affirmation, creation, love, community, beauty, and the countless ways humans have found to make life worth living despite its ultimate meaninglessness. The evolution of nihilism is not complete, and each of us must continue that evolution by wrestling with these questions in our own lives. There are no final answers, only the ongoing struggle to understand what it means to be human in a universe that does not care whether we exist. This is where nihilism leads us, not to despair or surrender, but to radical responsibility. If nothing matters except what we make matter, then everything depends on what we choose to make matter. That is both the terror and the freedom that nihilism reveals, and that revelation, uncomfortable as it is, might be exactly what we need to live honestly and courageously in an absurd world.